You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. I have Daniel Smalley. He's at Brigham Young University. He's a physicist they're in Provo, Utah. We're going to be talking about 3D projections or 3D holograms. So this would be a pretty cool call. So Daniel, thank you for coming.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yes, I guess as a layperson, I don't really know much about holograms. Like, what is a hologram versus a 3D projection? And then let's talk about how you're improving it.
Well, I think that the biggest difference is the screen. When we imagine a 3D image from science fiction, we imagine something that's projected out in air. We don't imagine having to look through glasses or having to look into a monitor to see that 3D image. And that then is the primary difference between volumetric technologies that you can see, like you look at a water fountain where the imagery just pops out. You don't have to be looking down into the water fountain to see it. So, and the more traditional 3D where you have to be looking into a screen like you look into a television. So that's the biggest difference between what we're doing and holography and other more traditional 3D approaches.
So how do holograms work at a 3D projection?
Yeah. Holography has a very specific scientific definition. I mean, holography has to do with the creation of wavefronts of light as light passes through patterns of lines and diffracts. And by that definition, you have to be looking at some diffractive surface to see that hologram. For light to enter your eyes, you have to be looking at some pattern of lines. By contrast, the 3D projection in general isn't creating images with just light alone. Image points in a volumetric display are actually little pieces of matter floating around in the air. And it's the combination of that little piece of matter as a scatterer and light scattering off that little piece of matter that create the image and give it a lot of its special abilities.
Okay. So where is the source of the light coming from to create a hologram or a 3D projection? And where does the viewer see it as if it's coming from, or it's coming from nowhere?
Yeah, so in a hologram, light is coming either from the back and transmitting through a film or a diffractive surface, or from the front, maybe from the top. You have lighting from the top, and light is reflecting off that surface and being modulated by those lines. In a projection display or a volumetric display, the light can come from a couple of different places. It could be coming from just about anywhere. It can be coming remotely from some illumination source. It could be illuminated just by room lights, or the little particles themselves, the little pieces of matter that make up the image points, could be luminous. They could be emitting light themselves. So there's many different ways that light can be emitted from an image point in a volumetric in a 3D projection display.
Well, we've seen, in the movies like with Tony Stark, in the Avengers, he puts on his gloves, he puts his hands into these holographic projections, and all of a sudden it works. And I don't know, in real life, what is it like, or what could it be like versus what we see in a movie?
So seeing that scene was actually annoying to me. I had been singing the praises of holography for most of my adult life at that point when I had seen it, that scene, and realized that was something that holography couldn't do. In particular, because light travels in straight lines through the air, and so light would have to either burrow through Tony Stark's hand to get to his eyes, or somehow turn around in midair. And it just wasn't something I could imagine holography doing. And I still believe that to be a fundamental limitation. Being able to have light, have an image that wraps around the human body is a difficult problem to solve. But 3D projections can do it. If you can place light scatterers anywhere you want, there's nothing stopping you from having those light scatterers placed above and around, behind the arms of an individual that you could actually live with and live in the same space as your 3D display. I imagine, for example, in medicine, you could imagine using a 3D projection to project on a potential, a prosthetic design onto the stump of somebody who's lost an arm or something like this. You could actually fit it to their stump. It could, and in fact, we play little games in our lab where we'll take little toys, like I've got a little Enterprise and a little Klingon battle cruiser, and we'll set it in the display. And I got a student who's got the little toys shooting photon torpedoes and phasers back and forth at each other. So it really, yeah. So I mean, you can actually breathe life into these otherwise inanimate physical objects by augmenting them with this 3D projection technology.
So where is it used, for the common person? The only place I've ever seen holograms is maybe a sticker on a piece of merchandise that, kind of looks a little bit orangey and green and somewhat like a cheap hologram. Or I go to a science center and I'll see one. But are there any commercial applications or wide-scale use applications of it?
For screen-based 3D, it's harder to find commercial applications, and it's because of the screen. For 3D, screen-based 3D to be useful, it needs to be really big, so that everywhere you're looking, you're more or less looking into that display. For this newer 3D projection technology, there's a lot more use cases, especially for small displays. We imagine, right now our images are really small. I mean, thumbnail size, but we hope to get them soon to maybe an 8-inch maximum dimension. And at that point, you could imagine using it for aerospace surveillance, tracking satellites, make sure there's no collisions or conjunctions. You could imagine using it for medical imaging, looking at catheters as they pass through, the vasculature of the body during, an intervention. Or you're even, telepresence, having little disembodied heads pop up out of your phone or watch and turn around and talk to you, just like a real person would, are all possibilities as we scale this technology.
So it sounds like it would have a big home in augmented reality applications.
Yeah, I think so. And one of the big bonuses is most 3D is really computationally intensive. That is to say, even a small holographic display can take a supercomputer to run. Wow. But with 3D projection technology, you really gotta. It really only requires red, green, blue, and XYZ for every image point in space. And so, for just the amount of computing power that your video card has in your laptop, you could run a pretty decent telepresence app, right, with maybe 1 million little particles running around. Drawing a face for you to talk to. So I think that there's a lot of advantages with computational complexity being much lower.
So what would be a more realistic interpretation of what's possible? Star Wars, perhaps? They were grainy, those images, but they're from a long time ago too.
Well, and they did that on purpose. I think that a lot of what happened in Star Wars was trying to make to tarnish science fiction so that it looked quotidian, make it look every day by making it look a little dusty. But and in fact, they, in the Princess Leia, George Lucas actually created vertical scan lines on purpose so that you would know that it was something different than television, which had horizontal scan lines. So all of this was carefully done to create a certain response in the viewers. But I think we can expect with 3D projection technology to be able to create all the images from science fiction that we've seen so far, including a few that we haven't seen. So definitely, I think we'll see Princess Leia projections. I definitely think we'll see an Avatar table. I think we'll see that Iron Man display. And I think we're going to see something brand new. I think we're going to see displays that are customizable so that we'll all be looking in the same space, but seeing something totally different, if that makes any sense.
That would not be possible.
Well, one of the very interesting things about 3D projection, at least the way that we're doing it in our lab, is that we can get light to scatter in one direction but not the other. So if you tried to project Princess Leia with an isotropic scatter, with fireflies, for example, you'd be able to see the front of Princess Leia and the back of her at the same time. You'd be able to see both her hair buns from every direction all the time. She looked like a ghost, so to speak. If you want to make her look self-solid, you have to have the ability, for example, to take one particle that only scatters forward and use that to draw the front of Princess Leia. And you take another particle that only scatters backward and draw the back of Princess Leia. And then you won't have this problem. She'll look self-solid. And but you can use that very same technology to make everybody see something different. So you could imagine a case where, there's this family room and you've got a little kid who's doing their homework in the middle of the room, in some central image volume. And then right next to her, mom is talking to grandpa, also in that same volume. And then next to her, dad is playing a soccer game. And, coupled with parametric speakers, they could have these totally immersive experiences, totally customized. And yet at the same time, not wearing glasses, not looking down at a screen, which would be pretty unique for an American family room. And but at the same, so in a way, what we're doing is instead of abstracting people into the digital world, we're taking data out and we're making it physical and we're putting it in our world. We're making it a physical part of our space.
Yeah, that's a lot cooler. I like that a lot better. So how does 3D projection work? I mean, can you reiterate it again and compare it to a hologram just once more? It just would help me get the concept of listeners too.
Yeah, so the way this works really sounds like science fiction from the very start. And we begin with a laser tractor beam. And we use this laser tractor beam to pick up a little particle of paper. And we scan that little particle around the image space. And as we scan it, we illuminate it with red, green, and blue lasers. That means that we can make it glow any color we want. So the combination of illuminating that particle and scanning it through the air gives us an effect not unlike what kids do with sparklers on the 4th of July. Well, they'll write your name in the air if you move that sparkler fast enough. So this is an effect called persistence of vision. So if we can get that little glowing particle moving around fast enough, we can make images. And if we move it even faster, we can make those images move, frame by frame, and do little animations, which is something we've started to do. We've got little stickmen that jump up and down on your finger or other little animations.
Are you using ambient dust particles, or where do the particles sit? And do they sit in the framework, or then you're good enough where they can move around randomly and still you can use them to create an image as long as there's a certain density?
We have a little cocktail of particle pieces that sit in a reservoir, and we have this automated technique for picking up particles out of this reservoir. The hope is that we can get good enough at automatically picking up these particles that even if you knocked it out, even if you stuck your hand in the image, knocked out the particle, that it could bend down, pick up a new one fast enough that you'd never even know anything had changed or anything had happened. And that way you could make it really robust. But we got a little reservoir of particles. It picks up from the little reservoir and it draws an image. And this, that's basically the MO.
Well, again, it picks up a particle. What does that mean? It magnetically moves one around or electrostatically? Like, how does it position and hold the particle in a certain spot? And would it be possible to use natural phenomena, natural Brownian motion of dust in an area to project the image onto, or a cloud or something like that? Vapor.
So, to answer your second question, I mean, there are certainly people out there who've worked with ambient dust. In fact, one of the earliest volumetric display concepts was put forth by Ken Perlin in a paper and a patent he called Hollow Dust, where he says, let's just take the dust bunnies, dust motes floating in the air, and we're going to scan the room to find where they are. And once we've found them, we're going to shoot visible laser beams at them to make them glow in the air. The problem being, of course, that you need a lot of dust in the air to make images that are nice and complete. The bonus here with what we're doing is that you don't have to modify the environment at all. So what we're doing is we take a laser beam and we focus it with a lens, but the lens is imperfect, and it creates an imperfect focus. It's got a hole in it. And that hole is a low intensity region. It's a dark spot. And when a little particle gets in that dark spot, if it tries to escape, it gets warmed up by the bright areas around the dark spot, and that creates kind of a jet action that pushes it back into the center. So it's basically stuck there. It's trapped. And then once it's in the trap, you can move the laser beam around, and you can move that hole around, and then the particle is going to be obligated to be dragged around with it.
Huh. So you're using essentially like a cage of laser beams to keep particles in a certain area?
Yep, that's right. We call them bottle beams. Yep.
Huh. I guess it's like when you go to a science place, science lab, and there's a ping pong ball, and it sits on a column of air, and it stays in the column of air because the pressure there is lower, and outside of the column of air is higher. So you're doing
right.
this, I guess, with heat.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Yeah.
Wow. So, all right. So by having a reservoir, can you say what the particles are made of in the reservoir?
Yeah, it's cellulose or paper. It's little carboniferous particles.
So there's no danger of someone like inhaling.
Oh, they could. I mean, they could absolutely inhale it, but it would just be one of the, thousands or millions of particles we inhale, at regular intervals. The average American household produces 40 pounds of this dust every year, right? So we're breathing this stuff in all the time. It wouldn't add very, it wouldn't have any effect on the total amount of dust we're breathing in. In fact, as you have mentioned, you could configure your display to be like a sponge where it's actually pulling dust out of the air when it's not doing other things. It's making It would actually make the air a little cleaner than it was otherwise. So yeah, we don't consider the health. There didn't necessarily be a health issue.
Actually, that's really interesting. What about other applications besides 3D projection? What if I don't know, you were to mount a column of this above a doorway, and it would trap and push down a gradient somehow, light gradient particles, and take them out of the ambient air? Could it be used to clean a space of particles?
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure it could. And while it may not be very effective on the Earth, where there are other more efficient ways of doing it, perhaps maybe in a place like maybe in other places with I don't know.
You mean like in space?
Yeah, I'm thinking in space. The problem with space is that there's no air, and you've got to have air for this to work. So there might be places where you just can't be blowing the air around or something like that. Yeah, I'm sure maybe let's say that you're dealing with, for example, dangerous things. Let's say you're trying to move, malaria or something else from one bottle to another, and you're just using in teeny tiny droplets, and you don't want anybody to touch it. You could use this to, transport little droplets from one place to another without anybody ever having to touch it. So there's a lot of non-destructive testing, and levitation is used broadly, and it has been for decades in lots of different fields. So it does have pretty broad applications outside of display.
Yeah, I know you don't want to go there too far, but yeah, I guess. So what size particle range does this work for? If you have a tuned system.
So particles can be trapped, from nanometers up to 50 or 100 microns, which is actually really big. We tend to use particles in the 10 micron range, and then of course it just depends on what we're trying to do. If we want to get nice directional scattering, and use a bigger particle. If we want light to go everywhere, if we want it just to glow everywhere, we'll use a smaller particle.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. How do you modulate resolution? In a given field of view, if you have areas of smaller particles and larger particles, I'm sure you could create all kinds of different effects. You can create like the body of an object and like maybe a diffuse area around it, for instance, if you wanted that effect by having different sized particles trapped.
Yeah, definitely having lots of traps enables us to do all sorts of potentially interesting things. I think the biggest thing that trapping multiple particles enables us to do is to make the display bigger. So right now, or at least until not long ago, what we were doing was just taking a single particle and moving it through a complicated path to make our images. But that's not very scalable as an approach. So one of the things we can do instead is have lots of traps holding lots of particles, and instead of moving it through a complicated path, we can just move it through a simple path, maybe just up and down, for example. So you can imagine a plane of particles to just move up and down and get illuminated as they go. And then you could imagine making much bigger images that way. That's how we hope to get to 8 inches and beyond. Though, inches is not the end here. We have sketched up designs that we hope will enable us to get to meter-sized displays. Wow. So we can do soldier decoys and this sort of thing.
Oh, wow. Huh. Yeah, I was going to ask you about some of the anticipated future applications. So that would be one. Any others that are really interesting to you?
So in addition to medical visualization and aerospace surveillance, definitely things like telepresence. But there's a lot of people who have approached me who seem to be really interested in AI agents, in making AI corporeal. So taking Alexa or Siri and giving them a little body, enabling them to interact with us face to face. You could imagine, for example, something like a holo nurse that could be projected around, could follow a loved one or a senior citizen around the house, who could help them with with medication compliance, make sure that they're taking the right stuff at the right time, and point to the label or do medical education, or even point out fall dangers as they're walking around during the day. That could be have a little friend. And the funny thing is that, if it's customizable, it could be a little friend that only you see. It could exacerbate this thing where you're walking down the street today and everybody seems to be schizophrenic if they're on their Bluetooth. It could get worse, right, where everybody's seeing something that only they can see and talking to them.
Yeah, I imagine, what if you're in a bank or let's say a nightclub, and the security level sees certain things that no one else can see. And, the customer level, they see stuff, and the boss sees other stuff.
Yeah,
in the
absolutely.
same environment, people literally would see different things, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, according to your security clearance or your proclivities or the language you speak, all these things could be customizable, and that could make, for very interesting scenarios.
You'd have redacted reality.
Yeah.
Well, very good. Well, what's the best way for folks to see some of this stuff? What's a link or two for them and to ask questions?
Yeah, so we have a website, Smalley Holography, and we have BYU has a bunch of resources online through the university pages, and we're always making things available through publications. So we're happy to point people to patents and papers that we're publishing out of our group.
Excellent. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yep, thank you.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.